The air in her father's house was thick with the scent of old books and lilies, a cloying combination of memory and grief. Clara stood by the window, a ghost in her own past, watching as guests murmured condolences on the overgrown lawn. Richard Sterling had not been a man of means, but he had been a man of immense, quiet brilliance. A man who saw the world in schematics and algorithms, not dollars and cents. A fact that her husband's family never let her forget. Across the crowded living room, she saw them. Eleanor, her mother-in-law, stood like a vulture carved from ice, her diamonds catching the dim light and throwing cruel little sparks around the room. Beside her, her husband, Leo, looked impossibly handsome and impossibly distant, his tailored suit a stark rebuke to the worn armchair he stood near. And then there was Marcus, Leo's younger brother, smirking into a glass of expensive whiskey he had brought himself, his eyes scanning the modest home with unconcealed contempt. They were a portrait of disdain, a tableau of condescension. For the 5 years Clara had been married to Leo, they had treated her with a chilling sort of tolerance. She was the drab little mouse who had somehow trapped their golden son, a temporary inconvenience until he came to his senses. They saw her father as nothing more than a failed eccentric, a garage tinkerer who had squandered his genius on pointless gadgets. They never understood that his mind was a cathedral of ideas, far grander than any mansion Eleanor could ever hope to own. Clara felt a hand on her arm, light and cold. It was Leo. He did not look at her, his gaze fixed on his mother across the room. "Clara," he said, his voice a low, rehearsed monotone. "My mother would like to say a few words." It was not a request. It was a summons. He led her to the center of the room, a lamb being guided to a place of sacrifice. Eleanor tapped a perfectly manicured nail against her crystal glass, the sound cutting through the somber atmosphere like a blade. The murmuring ceased. All eyes turned to the matriarch. "Thank you all for coming to support Clara in this difficult time," she began, her tone dripping with insincere sympathy. She let the pause hang in the air, a moment of feigned respect before the slaughter. "Richard was a man of ideas," she continued, the word ideas sounding like an insult. "He lived a simple life, a very, very simple life." Her eyes swept the room again, cataloguing every frayed curtain, every stack of dusty journals. And in that spirit of simplicity, we feel it's time to simplify things for Clara as well. Clara's heart began to pound, a frantic drum against her ribs. She saw the triumphant glint in Eleanor's eye. She saw the cold finality in Leo's profile. This was not an elegy for her father. This was an execution. "Leo has been burdened for too long," Eleanor announced, her voice rising with theatrical authority. "He has a brilliant future ahead of him, a future that cannot be weighed down by sentimental attachments." She turned her gaze directly on Clara, a predator locking onto its prey. "Leo is divorcing you, Clara, effective immediately." A collective gasp rippled through the room. It was a devastating public humiliation. Clara felt the floor drop out from under her. Her husband, the man she loved, stood silently beside her as his mother dismembered their life in front of strangers and friends. He would not even meet her eyes. But Eleanor was not finished. Her cruelty had a flourish, a final act. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a thick, white envelope. She waved it dismissively. "We are not monsters, of course. This is a small, charitable gesture. A few $1,000s to help you get back on your feet, to find a little apartment somewhere more appropriate for your circumstances." She did not hand it to Clara. She tossed it. The envelope fluttered through the air, and landed on the worn carpet at Clara's feet, a symbol of her worth in their eyes. Charity? Trash. "And it's a good thing we're settling this now," Eleanor crowed, her smile widening into a triumphant sneer. "Because Leo's company, Innovate Dynamics, has just secured a patent that will redefine the industry. We're talking billions, a new world, a world you, my dear, will have no part of." She raised her glass. "To the future, and to new beginnings." Leo and Marcus echoed the toast, their voices joining their mother's in a sickening chorus of victory. They were celebrating. At her father's funeral, in her father's home, they were celebrating her ruin. The room began to spin. Clara felt nothing but a vast, cold emptiness. Numbly, she bent down and picked up the envelope. Her fingers brushed against something hard and metallic inside, alongside the crisp stack of bills. A key, small and strangely shaped. Without thinking, she clutched it in her palm, the sharp edges digging into her skin, the only real thing in a world that had just shattered into a million pieces. The weeks that followed the funeral were a blur of grey. Clara moved through the days like a sleepwalker, the echoes of Eleanor's cruel words a constant hum in her ears. The public nature of the humiliation was a wound that refused to close. Friends of her father sent pitying looks, neighbours offered platitudes. Every sympathetic glance felt like another grain of salt being rubbed into her raw nerves. Leo had vanished from her life as completely as if he had never existed, leaving only a sterile email from his lawyer outlining the swift and brutal terms of their separation. She was to vacate their marital home within 30 days. The assets, the lawyer's letter coldly stated, were all tied to Leo's business ventures and family holdings. Clara, who had worked part-time at a local library to support them in the early years while Leo and his father poured money into the fledgling Innovate Dynamics, was entitled to nothing. It was a lie, a cruel and calculated fiction, but she lacked the strength and the resources to fight it. They were counting on that. They knew her humility and mistook it for weakness. Clara retreated to her father's house, the only sanctuary she had left. It was there, surrounded by the organized chaos of his life's work, that the numbness began to recede, replaced by a slow burning anger. She remembered the early days of her relationship with Leo. He had been charming, captivated by what he called her grounded nature. He seemed to admire her father's intellect, spending hours in Richard's workshop, asking questions and studying his designs. Now Clara saw it all with horrifying clarity. It was not admiration, it was reconnaissance. Leo's family had always been obsessed with status. Eleanor measured the worth of a human being by the brand of their shoes and the zip code of their address. She had seen Clara not as a daughter-in-law, but as a temporary key to Richard's genius. They had courted her to get close to her father. Years ago, Richard had sold an early set of patents to Leo for a shockingly small sum. A wedding gift, he had called it, though his eyes held a strange, sad wisdom. Leo had used that technology as the cornerstone of Innovate Dynamics. Eleanor and Marcus never missed an opportunity to remind Clara of this, framing it as an act of profound generosity on their part, as if they had done her family a favor by turning Richard's hobby into a real business. They loved the story of how they had transformed the ramblings of an old eccentric into a thriving enterprise. It fed their narrative of superiority. Their entire worldview was built on this fragile scaffolding of arrogance. They believed they were the creators, the visionaries, and that people like Clara and her father were merely the raw material for their success. They were convinced of their own impunity, certain that the world was designed to bend to their will. This new patent, the one Eleanor had gloated about, was to be their coronation, the final proof of their manifest destiny. As Clara began the painful task of sorting through her father's belongings, the anger solidified into something colder, harder. She packed away his clothes, the scent of him still clinging to the worn fabric. She carefully boxed up his journals, their pages filled with elegant equations and intricate drawings. It was in his old roll-top desk, tucked away in the back of a drawer filled with spare wires and fuses, that she found it, a heavy dark wood box with a small, peculiar lock. Her breath caught in her throat. She remembered the envelope. She fished it out of her purse, where it had remained untouched since the funeral. The cash was still there, a bitter reminder of Eleanor's charity. But beneath the bills was the key. She had almost forgotten it. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it out. It was old, made of brass, with a complex, star-shaped head. It looked like something from another century. With a deep, steadying breath, she inserted the key into the lock on the box. It turned with a satisfying, metallic click. The lid creaked open like an old church door. Inside there was no treasure, no hidden cash, no sentimental keepsakes. Instead, it was filled with documents, stacks of them. There were complex corporate diagrams that looked like spiderwebs, listing holding companies with nonsensical names like Argentum Holdings and Cygnus Ventures. There were old stock certificates and deeds of trust. And on top of it all, there was a single, sealed letter addressed to her in her father's familiar, spidery handwriting. "My dearest Clara," her hands shook as she read, "if you are reading this, it means I am gone and that the vultures have begun to circle. Do not mourn for me, my girl, and do not fear them. I have spent a lifetime building shields, and you are more protected than you can possibly imagine. These documents are your inheritance, not wealth for its own sake, but a tool, a weapon, if need be. Take them to a man named Alistair Finch. His office is at 14 Bishop's Court. He is the only person you can trust. Do not speak of this to anyone, especially not to Leo. Remember, Clara, the cleverest traps are the ones the prey helps to build themselves. They have been building their own for years. I only provided the materials. All my love, Dad." Clara read the letter 3 times, the words sinking in slowly. A trap, a weapon, Alistair Finch. The cryptic message sparked a flicker of hope in the darkness. While she was piecing together this puzzle, the antagonists were celebrating. An article appeared on the cover of a major business magazine. The innovators, Leo Vance, and the billion-dollar patent set to change the world. The photo showed Leo, Eleanor, and Marcus standing in front of the gleaming Innovate Dynamics headquarters, looking regal and untouchable. The article mentioned a lavish party they were hosting that Friday to celebrate the deal, a victory lap, a public declaration of their triumph. The timing was a deliberate final twist of the knife, scheduled just as Clara's 30 days in her marital home were set to expire. They were not just divorcing her, they were erasing her and throwing a party on the ashes of her life. Holding her father's letter, Clara felt a shift inside her. The victim was gone. In her place, something else was beginning to awaken, something cold, patient, and methodical, just like her father. Bishop's Court was a narrow, cobblestoned alley tucked away in the city's old financial district, a place the modern world seemed to have forgotten. Number 14 was a modest brick building with a heavy oak door. There was no grand sign, only a small, polished brass plate that read, "A. Finch, Solicitor." It was the kind of place that valued discretion over ostentation, a world away from the gleaming glass and steel of the Innovate Dynamics Tower. Clara clutched the heavy box of documents to her chest, her heart a nervous hammer against her ribs. She had called the number from her father's note, and a quiet, calm voice had simply said, He is expecting you." Now, as she pushed open the heavy door, she stepped into a quiet reception area that smelled of leather and beeswax. An elderly secretary looked up from a large ledger, smiled gently, and gestured toward a closed door. "Mr. Finch will see you now, Miss Sterling." Alistair Finch was a man who seemed to be from the same era as his office. He was tall and thin, with a shock of white hair and eyes that were both kind and piercingly intelligent. He wore a tweed jacket that had seen better days, yet he projected an aura of unshakable competence. He stood as Clara entered, shaking her hand firmly. "Clara, your father spoke of you often. He was very proud." His office was lined floor to ceiling with books, not just law tomes, but books on engineering, physics, and corporate strategy. Clara placed the wooden box on his vast mahogany desk. "My father. He told me to bring this to you. He said you were the only one I could trust." Finch nodded slowly, his eyes on the box. "Richard was a man of great foresight. He was also my oldest and dearest friend." He opened the box and began to sift through the documents, his expression unreadable. For nearly an hour the only sounds in the room were the rustle of paper and the distant chime of a city clock. Clara waited, her anxiety mounting with every passing minute. Finally Finch looked up, his gaze steady and serious. He folded his hands on the desk. "Clara," he began, his voice calm but heavy with significance. "What I am about to tell you will be difficult to process. Your father was not just a brilliant inventor. He was a master strategist, a grandmaster playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers." He picked up one of the spiderweb-like diagrams. "Years ago, when your father sold his initial patents to Leo's company, it was not an act of naivety. It was the first move in a very long game. He saw the greed in Leo and his family. He knew they would try to exploit him and, by extension, you. So he set a trap." Finch's explanation unfolded like a masterful thriller. The patents Richard had sold were real, but they were a Trojan horse. The sale contract contained clauses so complex and obscure that Leo's high-priced, arrogant lawyers had overlooked them. It only granted Innovate Dynamics a temporary, limited license to the technology. The core intellectual property, the foundational source code of the entire system, remained Richard's. But that was only the beginning. "Your father never stopped inventing," Finch continued, his voice tinged with admiration. "He lived modestly, but he licensed dozens of smaller, anonymous patents to companies all over the world. He made a quiet fortune. But he didn't spend it on fancy cars or houses." He gestured to the stacks of papers. "He spent it on this. He created a labyrinth of shell corporations and holding companies registered in jurisdictions from Switzerland to the Cayman Islands. They are completely anonymous, utterly untraceable. Through these entities, he began to buy up Innovate Dynamics' debt." Clara stared at him, trying to comprehend the scale of it. "Leo and his family were reckless," Finch explained. "They were over-leveraged, constantly borrowing against the company's future growth to fund their lavish lifestyle and Eleanor's social climbing. The banks that held their loans were only too happy to sell that debt to your father's anonymous companies, and then he started buying shares, quietly, in small blocks through dozens of different brokers. They never saw it coming." Finch slid a single, heavy document across the desk. It was a consolidated statement of holdings. Clara's eyes scanned the page, her mind reeling. The numbers were staggering. Argentum Holdings, Cygnus Ventures, and a dozen other ghost companies together owned 62% of Innovate Dynamics. They were the silent, invisible majority shareholder. "And the new patent," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "The billion-dollar deal they're celebrating?" A thin, grim smile touched Finch's lips. The crowning achievement of your father's plan. He developed that technology himself over the last 2 years. He filed the patent under a holding company called Sterling Prime Technologies. He then created a forged trail of data to make it look like Innovate Dynamics' own R&D department had developed it. He let them find it. He knew their arrogance and greed would prevent them from doing proper due diligence. They were so eager to claim a victory that they never bothered to check the patent office filings. The truth crashed down on Clara with the force of a physical blow. Her father had not been a victim. He had been a puppet master. "They are celebrating a patent they do not own," Finch stated, his voice cold as steel. "Their entire company valuation, their future, is based on an asset that belongs to Sterling Prime Technologies. And that is not all." He pointed to another set of documents. "The building they work in, the gleaming Innovate Dynamics Tower, it was mortgaged to the hilt. Your father bought the mortgage. They are tenants in a building that is now, effectively, yours. Their company cars are leased from a firm your father owned. Their biggest corporate loans are owed to you." It was a perfect, inescapable prison. Their entire world, every symbol of their success and arrogance, was a mirage built on assets that belonged to Richard Sterling. And now, as his sole heir, they belonged to Clara. They were throwing a party to celebrate becoming billionaires, but the fortune they were celebrating was already hers. Every single penny. They weren't just ruined. They had been ruined for years and were simply the last to know. Clara sat back in her chair, the leather creaking under her weight. The grief for her father was still there, a deep, aching void. But now it was mingled with a profound, staggering sense of awe. He had not left her defenseless. He had left her an empire, forged in secret and designed for one purpose, to deliver justice. The image of Eleanor's sneering face flashed in her mind, the memory of the envelope hitting the floor, the hurt, the humiliation, the years of being treated like an inferior being. It all coalesced into a single point of cold, crystalline fury. She looked at Alistair Finch, her eyes no longer filled with the tears of a grieving daughter, but with the fire of a queen about to claim her throne. The shock had passed. The decision was made. "They threw a party to celebrate my ruin," Clara said, her voice low and steady, a chilling counterpoint to the storm brewing inside her. "It's only fair that I provide the fireworks." Finch watched her, his expression one of solemn approval. He had been waiting for this. He had known Richard's plan, had helped him execute its legal intricacies for over a decade. He saw the same steel in Clara's eyes that he had so often seen in her father's. The sleeping giant was awake. "Your father prepared for this moment," Finch said, pulling a fresh set of documents from a drawer. They were thick and bound in blue legal covers. "This is the final step of his plan. These documents will transfer the directorship of all his holding companies and the entirety of his estate into your name. Once you sign these, you will have absolute control, the power to maintain the status quo or the power to dismantle their entire world." Clara didn't hesitate. She picked up the heavy fountain pen from his desk, the pen her father had left for her. The ink was a dark, definitive black. She signed her name on the first line, her hand steady. With each signature, she felt a piece of the old, timid Clara fall away. She was no longer the victim. She was the inheritor of a righteous, patient vengeance. She was her father's daughter. When the last document was signed, she pushed the stack back across the desk. "Mr. Finch," she said, her tone now crisp and authoritative, "I don't want to just dismantle their world. I want them to watch it burn, and I want them to know that I am the one holding the match." Finch nodded, a strategist recognizing his commander. "Then we shall proceed. We will not be governed by anger, Clara. We will be surgical. We will use the system they worship, the law, finance, the market, to bring them to their knees. Their own arrogance will be our primary weapon. For the next 2 hours, they formulated the plan. It was elegant in its cruelty, a multi-stage assault designed for maximum psychological and financial impact. It was a cascade where each action would trigger the next, creating an unstoppable avalanche of ruin. Stage 1. The financial squeeze. On Friday morning, hours before their celebratory party, we will strike, Finch explained. The holding companies you now control will simultaneously recall every loan owed by Innovate Dynamics. The demands will be for immediate and full repayment. It will be a liquidity crisis from which they cannot recover. Stage 2. The patent bomb. At midday, as their panic is peaking, Sterling Prime Technologies will issue a formal cease and desist letter to Innovate Dynamics, their board of directors, and the major financial news outlets. It will state, in no uncertain terms, that they have no legal right to the patent their entire valuation is based on, and that any attempt to use or market it will be met with legal action for intellectual property theft. Stage 3. The shareholder coup. With the stock in freefall and the company facing insolvency and federal investigation for fraud, you, as the majority shareholder, will call for an emergency board meeting to remove Leo Vance as CEO and dissolve the current board for gross mismanagement and malfeasance. Stage 4. The eviction. The final blow, Finch said, a grim satisfaction in his voice. The entity that owns their headquarters will deliver an eviction notice for breach of contract, citing the impending bankruptcy. They will be physically removed from their castle. The plan was perfect. It was cold, legal, and utterly devastating. It used their own systems, their own rules against them. There would be no angry confrontations, no shouting matches, just the quiet, implacable grinding of a machine they could not see, operated by the woman they had thrown away like garbage. Clara stood up, feeling a sense of calm she hadn't experienced in years. "Initiate the plan, Mr. Finch." Finch reached for the phone. His first call was to a contact at a financial regulatory agency, an anonymous tip about potential patent fraud at a high-flying tech company. The second was to the legal firm tasked with delivering the loan recall notices. The first domino was pushed. The machine had been activated. Clara walked out of the old brick building and back into the modern world. The city buzzed around her, oblivious, but she knew that the foundations of a glittering empire just a few miles away were already beginning to crack. Friday was coming, and with it, the reckoning. Friday morning dawned bright and clear, a perfect day for a celebration. At the Innovate Dynamics Tower, a festive atmosphere was already building. Caterers were setting up for the evening's grand party on the top-floor event space. In the boardroom, Leo Vance was holding a meeting, his voice resonating with pride and arrogance as he outlined the company's glorious future. He felt like a king surveying his domain. "This patent is just the beginning," he declared to his senior team. "In 5 years, the name Innovate Dynamics will be spoken in the same breath as Apple and Google. We are on the verge of creating a dynasty." His mother, Eleanor, who had insisted on attending the meeting, beamed from her seat at the table. Marcus lounged beside her, already picturing the yacht he was going to buy. They were at the absolute pinnacle of their triumph, intoxicated by their success. It was precisely at that moment that Leo's assistant, a nervous young woman named Amy, tiptoed into the room and handed him a sealed courier envelope. "This just arrived, Mr. Vance. It's marked urgent and personal." Leo waved a dismissive hand. "Probably another congratulatory note. Open it later." "Sir, the courier said it was from a law firm representing Argentum Holdings. He insisted you see it immediately." Leo's brow furrowed. "Argentum Holdings." The name sounded vaguely familiar, one of the faceless investment firms that had bought up some of their debt years ago. Annoyed at the interruption, he tore it open. His eyes scanned the dense legal text. His confident smile faltered. It was a formal demand for the immediate and full repayment of a loan for $87 million, payable within 24 hours. He let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Well, it seems someone at Argentum has made a rather amusing clerical error." He tossed the letter onto the table. Before anyone could respond, Amy entered again, looking even more terrified. She held 2 more envelopes. "Sir, these just arrived, from firms representing Cygnus Ventures and Apex Consolidated." Leo's blood ran cold. He snatched the letters from her. They were identical to the first, a demand from Cygnus for $65 million, a demand from Apex for $112 million. The numbers swam before his eyes. It was not a mistake. It was a coordinated attack. In the space of 5 minutes, nearly $250 million of debt had been called in. Panic began to bloom in his chest, cold and suffocating. "Get our CFO in here now," he barked. "Call the banks. Find out who these people are." Eleanor looked on, her perfectly composed face now a mask of confusion and anger. "Leo, what is this nonsense? Some little bureaucrat is trying to ruin our day. Have them fired." "It's not that simple, Mother," Leo snapped, his voice tight with fear. The room, once buzzing with celebratory energy, was now thick with a dreadful silence. His frantic calls to his bankers yielded nothing. The loans had been sold and resold into a labyrinth of private equity. The entities demanding payment were ghosts, with no phone numbers, no public-facing personnel, only impenetrable legal representatives who refused to negotiate. As the morning wore on, the panic escalated into sheer terror. The news of the loan recalls leaked from a source within the company hit the financial wire services. The pre-market stock price for Innovate Dynamics, which had been soaring, suddenly began to wobble. Investors were getting spooked, and then at exactly 12 p.m., the second stage of Clara's plan was executed. An official press release distributed globally appeared on every major news terminal. It was from a company no one had ever heard of, Sterling Prime Technologies. The headline was a bombshell. Sterling Prime Technologies asserts sole ownership of Innovate 7 patent, issues cease and desist to Innovate Dynamics for infringement. The press release was brutal and precise. It stated that Innovate Dynamics had no legal right to the patent, that their claims were fraudulent, and that any commercial use of the technology would result in immediate and massive legal action. To prove their claim, the release included the official patent registration numbers and filing dates, verifiable by anyone in seconds. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The stock market opened, and Innovate Dynamics' stock didn't just fall, it evaporated. It plummeted 90% in the first 10 minutes of trading before the exchange halted it. The company's valuation, which had been in the billions just hours before, had been wiped out. Leo watched the ticker on his computer screen, his face ashen. It was a bloodbath. From the quiet of her father's home, Clara watched the news reports on television. She saw the panicked faces of financial reporters, the plummeting red arrows on the screen. There was no joy, no triumph, just a cold, quiet satisfaction, a sense of order being restored. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Finch. Stage 2 complete. They are in freefall. The cascade was in full effect. The SEC immediately announced a formal investigation into Innovate Dynamics for securities fraud. The company's credit lines were frozen by their banks. Their suppliers, seeing the writing on the wall, began demanding cash on delivery for all orders. The entire edifice of their success, built on a foundation of lies and debt, was crumbling in real time. Late in the afternoon, Clara's phone rang. It was an unknown number. She answered. "Clara?" The voice was strained, desperate. It was Leo. "Leo," she said, her own voice perfectly calm, a stark contrast to his ragged panic. "Clara, thank God. We've run into a problem. A temporary cash flow issue. Some rivals, they're playing dirty, trying to sabotage us just before the big launch." He was completely, blissfully ignorant. He had no idea. The irony was so thick she could taste it. "It's a mess," he continued, his voice cracking. Clara, I need to ask you for a loan. Just a little something to tide us over. You must have something left from your father, right? Anything would help. I'll pay you back, I swear. Double." He was calling her, the woman he had discarded and humiliated, to beg for money to save the empire he had built by betraying her. It was a moment of schadenfreude, so pure, so perfect. It was almost poetic. Clara let the silence hang for a moment before replying, her voice laced with a gentle, feigned sympathy. "Oh, Leo, I'm so sorry to hear that, but I don't have anything. Eleanor's charity was very generous, but it's barely enough for me to find a new place to live. I'm afraid I can't help you." She heard a strangled sound on the other end of the line, a mix of frustration and despair. After a moment, he hung up without another word. Clara put down the phone. The king was begging a pauper for help, never realizing the pauper owned the entire kingdom. The party that evening, she knew, would no longer be a celebration. It would be a wake. The sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the city. At the Innovate Dynamics Tower, the caterers were packing up. The champagne was being put back on ice. The party was cancelled. In its place, a grim, desperate meeting was taking place in the boardroom. The air, which had crackled with triumph that morning, was now heavy with the stench of failure and fear. Eleanor, her face a ghastly shade of pale beneath her expensive makeup, was in a state of furious denial. "This is a conspiracy!" she shrieked, her voice thin and ragged. "Our enemies have conspired to ruin us! We must fight back! We will sue everyone!" Marcus was slumped in a chair, already halfway through a bottle of scotch, his bravado having evaporated with the company's stock price. Leo stood by the vast window, staring down at the city lights, his reflection a ghostly image of a broken man. The empire he thought he had built was a pile of rubble, and he couldn't understand how it had happened. Their world had collapsed in less than 8 hours. They were financially, professionally, and socially ruined. The SEC investigation meant potential prison time. The loan recalls meant bankruptcy. The patent revelation meant their entire business was a fraud. They had nothing left. In their desperation, their minds turned to the only person they could think to blame, the person who had always been their scapegoat. "This is Clara's fault," Eleanor hissed, her eyes wild. "Her bad luck. She brought this curse upon us the day you married her, Leo. We must get her here. She needs to make a statement, tell the press. This is all a misunderstanding. She owes us that." It was a mad, desperate gambit, born of a lifetime of arrogance. They still believed they held power over her. They still saw her as the meek little mouse they could bully into submission. Leo, seeing no other option, made the call. He didn't beg, he demanded. "Clara, you need to come to the office. Now, we need to talk." An hour later, Clara walked into the lobby of the Innovate Dynamics Tower. The building was eerily quiet, the few remaining employees scurrying about with panicked looks, avoiding eye contact. She took the elevator to the top floor. When the doors opened, she stepped into the cavernous boardroom. They were all there, a trinity of despair. Eleanor, Leo, and Marcus. They looked haggard, defeated, like monarchs moments after a coup. But the moment they saw her, their arrogance flickered back to life. Clara was not the woman they remembered. The grieving, timid widow was gone. In her place stood a woman of immense composure and cold, quiet power. She wore a simple but exquisitely tailored black suit. Her hair was pulled back, her expression unreadable. She looked, in a word, formidable. "Clara, finally!" Eleanor surged forward. "You have to help us. You have to go to the press. Tell them this sterling prime is a fraud. Tell them the patent is ours. Your father gave it to us." Leo stepped in front of his mother, his face a mask of pleading desperation. "Clara, please, everything is gone. We're ruined. You're the only one who can help us, for the sake of what we once had." Clara looked at him, at the man who had stood by silently, while his mother publicly destroyed her. She looked at Eleanor, the architect of her humiliation. She looked at Marcus, who was smirking even in ruin. A cold, glacial calm settled over her. The time for observation was over. The time for revelation had come. "You threw a party to celebrate ruining me?" she began, her voice soft but carrying to every corner of the silent room. "In my father's house on the day of his funeral, you toasted to my destruction." She took a step forward, her gaze locking onto Leo's. "You laughed while your mother threw an envelope of cash at my feet. You called it charity, but you made a mistake. A very, very big mistake." A flicker of confusion crossed their faces. They were expecting tears, pleas, or perhaps a negotiation. They were not prepared for this. "You see," Clara continued, her voice gaining a sharp, cutting edge, "you were celebrating with my money. You were hosting a party in a building that I own to toast a patent that belongs to me." She let the words hang in the air. Leo stared at her as if she had sprouted a second head. "What are you talking about?" he stammered. "You're hysterical." "Am I?" Clara said, a chilling smile playing on her lips. "Let me simplify it for you in a way that even you can understand. The company you thought was a rival, Sterling Prime Technologies? That's my company. The faceless holding firms that recalled your loans this morning, Argentum and Cygnus? Also mine. For the past 10 years, my father, the man you mocked as a failed tinkerer, was slowly, patiently buying your company out from under you." The colour drained from Leo's face. Eleanor looked like she had been struck by lightning. "He owned it all, Leo." Clara's voice was now a whip. "Every share, every loan, every asset. He owned 62% of Innovate Dynamics. He owned the mortgage on this very building. He was your silent majority owner. And now, as his sole heir, I am. Your company was never yours. It was a toy my father let you play with. And today, I decided to take my toy back." The truth, undeniable and monstrous, crashed down upon them. It was impossible, insane, and yet it explained everything. The surgical precision of the attack, the untraceable entities, the perfect, devastating timing. Eleanor began to tremble, her face contorting in a mask of rage and disbelief. "Lies! It's all lies! You're a nobody! A little rat from a broken home!" she screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical shriek. "The truth doesn't care about your opinion, Eleanor," Clara said coldly. "The SEC filings will confirm it. The bank records will confirm it. The deed to this building confirms it." Marcus, fueled by scotch and rage, suddenly lunged toward Clara. "You lying witch!" he roared. He never reached her. Two large men in dark suits who had entered the room silently behind Clara stepped forward and intercepted him, holding him back with professional ease. They were her security team. Clara didn't even flinch. She looked past the struggling Marcus to Leo, whose entire world had shattered behind his eyes. He just stared at her, his arrogance replaced by a hollow, vacant horror. "The divorce papers you served me are meaningless, Leo," Clara stated, delivering the final, crushing blow. "Under the law, all marital assets are divided, but since all the assets were secretly mine to begin with, you walk away with exactly what you brought into our marriage. Nothing." She turned her attention to Eleanor, who had collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably. "As for your party," Clara said, her voice devoid of all emotion, "consider it my gift to you, a celebration of the moment you lost everything." She turned her back on them, the broken family in their stolen, collapsing castle. "Mr. Finch's lawyers will be here in the morning to oversee the liquidation," she said over her shoulder. "My security team will escort you from the premises. You have 1 hour to collect your personal belongings." She walked toward the elevator, her steps sure and steady. She did not look back. The sounds of Eleanor's hysterical sobs and Marcus's impotent threats faded as the elevator doors slid shut, sealing them in the tomb of their own making. The reckoning was complete. Justice had been served. In the year that followed, the downfall of the Vance family was as complete as it was public. The story of the secret heiress and the corporate takeover became a legend in the financial world, a cautionary tale about arrogance and deceit. Leo, facing a mountain of evidence from the SEC investigation initiated by Finch's anonymous tip, pleaded guilty to multiple counts of securities fraud. He was sentenced to 5 years in a minimum security federal prison, a stunning fall from grace for the man who was once on the cover of magazines. His name became synonymous with hubris. Eleanor's fate was, in some ways, crueler. Stripped of her wealth and status, the things she valued above all else, she was cast out from the high society circles she had fought so desperately to conquer. Her friends abandoned her, her invitations dried up, and she was forced to sell her mansion and all its trappings to pay off personal debts. She ended her days in a small, dreary, rented apartment, a bitter, forgotten woman haunted by the ghosts of a life she had lost, her only company the endless reruns of daytime television. Marcus, facing his own legal troubles and with no family fortune to protect him, simply disappeared. Rumors circulated that he was working a menial job in another state, a shadow of the arrogant parasite he once was. Their world had not just been dismantled, it had been erased from existence. Clara, however, did not step into the life of a billionaire socialite. She had no interest in the world that had consumed Leo's family. True to her father's spirit, she saw her inheritance not as a prize, but as a responsibility. She liquidated the labyrinthine corporate structure her father had created, dissolving the shell companies and selling off the frivolous assets. The only thing she kept was the core of the company, the technology, the labs, and the brilliant engineers who had been working there, unaware of the drama unfolding in the boardroom. She rebranded the company, stripping away the soulless corporate name Innovate Dynamics. In its place, she founded the Sterling Institute, a non-profit foundation named in her father's honor. Its mission was simple: to find and fund brilliant, under-resourced inventors and thinkers, the kind of people the world often overlooked, the kind of person her father had been. She poured the vast fortune into an endowment that would allow the Institute to operate in perpetuity, a lasting monument to Richard Sterling's true genius. Her life found a new, quiet purpose. She wasn't a CEO in a power suit, she was a patron, a facilitator of dreams. She spent her days walking through the bustling labs of the Sterling Institute, talking with young, passionate scientists and engineers, her heart filled with a sense of peace she had never known. She had taken the weapon her father had given her and used it not just to achieve justice, but to build something beautiful and lasting. One afternoon, while reviewing blueprints for a new wing of the Institute, she found herself in an easy conversation with the project's lead architect, a kind, thoughtful man with warm eyes and a gentle smile. He spoke of building things that last, of integrity in design, and of creating spaces that served people. In his words, she heard an echo of her father's values, a stark contrast to the hollow ambition of Leo and his family. It was not a dramatic romance, but the quiet, promising beginning of a new, healthy chapter. A final scene crystallized her victory. She stood on the observation deck of the Sterling Institute, looking out over the city. She was no longer the timid victim of a cruel family's ambition. She was a woman in full command of her destiny, a protector of her father's legacy, and a force for good in the world. She had found her power not in the billions she controlled, but in the purpose she had created. True wealth, she had learned, isn't measured in dollars or stock prices, but in integrity and character. Those who build their empires on foundations of cruelty and deceit are destined to watch them crumble into dust before their very eyes. The greatest victory was not in the taking, but in the rebuilding. The ultimate vindication was not in their ruin, but in her own quiet, meaningful, and unshakable peace.